So today we are going to be getting into the seventh commandment, which is do not steal. Now, whenever we start looking at the Ten Commandments, I said from the very beginning that this is God's way of living. And it's for our benefit. It really is. It's for our good. And you may think to yourself, hey, it would be really cool if, I don't know, if there wasn't any government and there wasn't any law about stealing, because now we can just simply go and steal stuff anytime that we wanted to. We may think, hey, that actually sounds really neat, doesn't it? Well, except that it doesn't, because it's going to immediately backfire. Imagine living in a world where there was no law about stealing, and that means any time someone can just come up to you and mug you, or they could come into your home, they could steal stuff. And so really it's like, this is very logical, right? Whenever we talk about do not steal, it's a good moral principle. It really is. And really, this is something that we see as being pretty darn universal throughout. Just about every society has had laws regarding stealing. In fact, some countries take stealing very, very, very seriously, to the point where, well, if you look at back in the Romans, Jesus was on the cross, and he was on the cross next to two thieves. And so you got to understand that stealing has really been considered to be immoral. It's considered to be a sin, something that is between right and wrong is considered wrong for millennia. And part of this is because God's law is really kind of innate in our hearts. It's really kind of part of who we are. We have our conscience that helps guide between what's right and wrong. And so really this commandment here is certainly for our benefit, because if we live a life of integrity, meaning doing the right thing even when no one is looking, even if we are honest at times when no one even notices it, it actually is for our good. It builds our character. We're going to talk more about that later. But also what it does is it protects us as well from other people stealing. So whenever we talk about stealing, the question, of course, is, well, what exactly is this commandment about? And the most obvious thing that we can think of when we think of stealing is we think of things like shoplifting. And certainly this does apply to this commandment. Shoplifting is certainly about the seventh commandment. In fact, it's something that is unfortunately very rampant. In fact, if you take places like Target, for example, they actually have to charge everything by an extra, say, 2 or 3% because of theft, because people steal. And so in order to make up for that loss in profit, they actually have to charge everyone, including you and me, people who don't steal, that extra little bit. And by the way, this is something that teenagers struggle with. In fact, I counseled a 16-year-old a few years ago who was going into Target with a few friends, and he had his backpack on, and so his friends convinced him to put an item, I forget how much it was, I think it was like $100 item, into his backpack. And I mean, it's not smart. I mean, let me just say that, because there's security cameras all around, and it's obvious that you're shoving something into your backpack. And of course, they just walk out without buying anything. So you have teenagers that walk into Target with backpacks, they walk out without paying for anything. Come on. So the security guard stops them. They actually end up calling the police and pressing charges. Not only did he have to pay a $5,000 fine for his theft, but also he had to hire a lawyer to avoid juvenile jail time, I think an additional $5,000. So he spent $10,000 on a very, very stupid mistake. So certainly that's what it's about. It's also about things like breaking and entering into someone's home or place of business. It's about mugging. It's about all those certain things. And we could just stop there. And we could just say, hey, you know what? Do not steal. Boom, we all get it, and we move on. But I will say this, that there's also a few different ways, especially in our culture today, that people steal, and they almost don't even call it stealing. It's really funny. They'll say things like, oh, well, we're just bending the rules a little bit here, or, well, I'm just, I deserve this, and so I'm just taking what's mine. And so people actually steal in a few different ways that a lot of people don't necessarily call it stealing, but it is. And that's the thing, is that if if you have to call it something else, it's not stealing. When it's stealing, it's stealing. It's still stealing. It certainly is. So let's look at our first point here. Our first point here, how people steal today, that are oftentimes unnoticed and they don't call it stealing, is simply by deceiving customers. So this is where a place of business will rip off their customers. In Amos, it actually condemns this. It says they overcharge, they use false measures and fix the scales to cheat the customers. So in this case, cheating customers would be to price gouge, to overcharge for something. Now, obviously, as a place of business, you have to make a profit. And so if a product costs, let's say, $1 to make and you sell it for $2, that's not price gouging. That's just simply being a responsible business. Otherwise, you will go out of business if you never turn a profit. But whenever you price gouge or whenever you do something that's corrupt, price gouging, especially in a time of crisis, like let's take the coronavirus, for example, and people are overcharging for like $100 for a bottle of sanitizer or something like that, is absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely robbery. It is. It's stealing. That's what it's doing. It's taking advantage of someone who needs something, and then you're overcharging for that. As well, this could be that maybe you have a faulty product as a company, and you know that it's a faulty product, but you sell it anyways. And people do this all the time, especially with things like cars. They know that their car has a bad transmission on it, but they don't say anything and they sell it anyways, just hoping the person gets suckered into something like that. Well, you know what the Bible calls that? The Bible calls that stealing. So there you go. Now, we're going to look at on the other side of the coin here, but it's similar, and it's kind of the other side of the street here. It's actually not about businesses defrauding their customers, but rather it's about the employees themselves doing it to their place of business. So the second way here is about how people will defraud their employers. There we go. Will defraud. I got to say that again. So the second point here is by defrauding employers. You see, whenever you have a job, Colossians 3 calls us to whatever you do. So if you work fast food, if you work for a Fortune 500 company as an executive, whatever your deal is, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. So remember that in everything you are serving God himself. And so one of the problems that people will do, and by the way, stealing from your employer is, well, it's against the law, all right? And you could get fired for this. You could even be pressed charges. You could even go to jail, depending upon the situation. But this happens at all levels. It happens at the minimum wage level, and it happens at the CEO executive level. Let me give you an example. So, and I know this is a huge thing because whenever I worked in the fast food industry, this was a very common thing that people did, is that they would, let's say, so I worked at Starbucks, so they would make a Frappuccino for themselves and not pay for it. And well, what's that called? That's called stealing from your employer. Now, if your employer says, we will give you 1 cup of coffee per shift or something like that, and then you go on the register and you swipe your card and you just get that, then that's a perk. That's a bonus. That's not stealing because that's a legal way of acquiring that cup of coffee. But if you are just taking it without paying for it, what's that called? That's called stealing. And also what was really, really rampant when I worked fast food, and I assume it's still today, although I hope it's not. Maybe things with extra security measures with cameras and so forth have changed some of this, but certainly you could take the same cup of coffee, and rather than you consume it, you would give it out to your friends. And so it's kind of a way of almost buying friends, so to speak. Hey, let's all go to Chipotle because he's going to give us free burritos. And so forth. And so really that's another way that people will steal. They'll steal from their employer. Now, that does happen at the minimum wage level, but it happens all the way up, especially if you're, let's say, if you're in charge of a large corporation and you're the one who's in charge of all the accounting, all the finances. Well, there is this legal term, it's called embezzlement. And basically, it's a fancy word for saying stealing from your employer, where what you'll do is you'll channel money that's supposed to go to the business into your own personal accounts, or maybe you have personal expenses that you get reimbursed or that you charge on the company credit card. And so again, what's that called? That's called stealing. Now, we call it embezzling because that is, well, it's the fancy legal term for that, but it is stealing. And people do this, unfortunately, way too often. And it really could start even as something as simple as taking, Post-it notes or ink pens from the office and then bringing them home. And then you've got tons of office supplies at home. But what's that called? It's called stealing, all right? So that's a second way. A third way is by defrauding the Lord, by defrauding God. And so this one, I got to tell you, may be a little bit of a shocker to you, maybe a little bit of a surprise to you, because whenever we think of stealing, we think of going into Target and stealing something, right? But God actually says that whenever we do not honor him with our tithes and our offerings, whenever we do not put him first in the area of our finances, we're actually robbing him. We're actually stealing from him. I know this is crazy to think about. It really is. Because whenever we think about tithing or giving money to God or to the church or to missionaries, what we typically think of is we think of, oh, this is me just doing something nice. But that's not the case. You see, God actually calls us. It's a commandment in the Old Testament and repeated throughout the Bible, where God says that we are to give a tenth, 1/10. So that's the word tithe. Tithe just means 1/10 of our income to God. Now, why in the world would God ask us to do that? Well, Deuteronomy even tells us why, because it teaches us to revere him. It teaches us to trust and love and respect and revere God. In fact, the first person to tithe in the Old Testament was Abraham, and he set 10% aside for God, because customarily what you did back then was you took your 10% and gave it to your king. And he gave it to God first, saying, God, you are my king. And that's what we do today, is that whenever we tithe and whenever we have our income, something that God has blessed us with. And that's the thing, is that we think that, oh, this is mine, and we put our fist around it. No, actually what our income is, the reason we have an income is because God has given us this income. And all he's asking for is 10% in return to teach us to revere him. Now, you may be in middle school and you may be saying, yeah, but Mike, I mean, come on, I'm in middle school, like I don't have an income. Well, I will say this, that when I was in middle school, we mowed lawns and we earned an income that way. But even so, think about things like your allowance. Think about things like whenever you do get a job, and let's say 10th or 11th grade, and let's say you're making minimum wage. And I remember actually thinking when I was in 10th grade and I was making it big, I was making a whopping $5 an hour. And I said to myself, is God really interested in 50 cents an hour? I mean, come on. I mean, I'm going to put pennies literally into the offering plate when there could be someone who comes by and puts like thousands of dollars in the offering plate. So is God really interested in my pennies, or is he really interested in these thousands of dollars? And the answer absolutely is he is very interested. He is very interested in our heart, because that's what it does. It speaks to that. It speaks to our heart. In fact, there is a whole story in the New Testament where this lady gives everything that she has, which are just 2 little pennies. And all these people are throwing thousands of dollars in. And Jesus commends the woman for giving all that she has, because to her, that's everything that she has. So is God interested in pennies? Absolutely. Not because they're pennies, but because it's your heart and it's your act of worship. And I also remember thinking, man, if I can't even tithe 50 cents an hour, what's going to happen whenever I'm 40 years old and I'm making $10 million a year? Can I be able to tithe $1 million a year? And the answer is, okay, maybe I will never make $10 million a year. But if I did, absolutely I would give $1 million a year to God, because that's the way of tithing. And Malachi actually says this. It says, will you rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. So Malachi, which God is speaking to the prophet Malachi here. This is God speaking. God is saying that whenever we don't, it's not only that we are just disobeying his commandment, we're actually robbing him. Okay, so let's get into a few things here about why be honest. Now, there's the obvious things like, oh, I don't know, not going to jail. Maybe if you try to break and enter, maybe someone will shoot you and kill you. All right, those are pretty obvious things and very, very motivating reasons as to why we should not steal. But it is more than that. it's more than just avoiding jail time. There's actually a few different reasons. The first reason here is because I am being watched by God. I am being watched by God. Job says this, "For his eyes are on the ways of a man, and he sees all his steps. There is no gloom or deep darkness where evildoers may hide themselves." In other words, God sees everything. And the thing I hear from people who steal is they say things like, "Oh, I got away with it." Well, even if you got away with the security cameras, and even if you got away with the police not catching you, do you really believe that you got away with it? Because if we really believe in God, and we really believe that God is all powerful, that he is all knowing, that he sees everything, he hears everything, did you really get away with it? And the obvious answer is no, absolutely not. You did not get away with it. And so what we need to first recognize here is that one of the reasons, to be honest, is because God sees. God sees everything. The second reason is because I will reap whatever I sow. And so this is a concept that comes from the book of Galatians, and it says this: "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, he will also reap." So this is a farming term here. Now, I know a lot of us are not farmers, but it's a pretty simple concept. I think you can understand it. In fact, if you've ever planted anything and grown anything, think back to either maybe when you're in kindergarten and you put like the lima bean in the soil and it grew, right? You reap. So in other words, what you're going to get as a result is whatever seed is put into it, whatever you sow. So if you plant a lima bean, you're going to get a lima bean, right? If you plant an orange tree seed, you're going to get an orange tree seed. So you are going to reap whatever it is that you sow. And of course, Galatians talks about this not just because it's farming, but because it has to do with our lives. And it's a metaphor here that says that whatever you do, you're going to experience the results of those things. You're going to reap the consequences for those actions. So whatever you sow, whatever you do, you're going to experience those results. It's kind of like the what comes around goes around thing, but not exactly, other than to say that if you're someone who is constantly looking for that extra thing to bend the rules, to steal, to take from other people, then you reap what you sow. You are going to experience the consequences for those things. It could be that maybe someone does steal back from you. That could be it too. But more importantly, maybe it is things like you go to jail. Maybe it is things like if you fraudulently report a credit card, let's say, and your wife finds out about it later in marriage, and then you get a divorce. In other words, there are consequences to your actions. And with sin, there's always a consequence. There always is. And in fact, some of these are external consequences, but some of them are internal, which actually leads us to this next point here, because dishonesty damages my character. Dishonesty damages my character. So basically, even if you do feel like you got away with it from the security cameras, the police, you somehow pretend that God isn't watching, it's going to affect your heart, and it's going to damage your character, your integrity. And this also has to do with your reputation. You are suddenly not someone who can be trusted. If you're someone who is constantly stealing from people, people are going to see that. And they're not going to be able to trust you. They're not going to be able to give you things to be able to be responsible for. And so ultimately it does. It damages your heart. It damages your relationships. It damages your character. And also, here's our final point here. And it's just simply that God will reward my honesty. He will reward my honesty. So in other words, what we're talking about here is that God, because he sees and hears, that even if no one notices that you were honest in a situation, and maybe even if you're falsely accused, but you know that you were honest and you did everything as well as you could without stealing, then people are going, even if people don't see that, God certainly does. And God he will reward you. He will trust you with bigger and greater blessings. And so we have this parable here. And this parable is back when Jesus talks about how there was a guy who was given these treasures, and he was to hide them. And he was responsible with just a little bit. And because it was like a little test, because he was responsible for the little bit, now the master said, oh, okay, well, if you can handle this, now that I know you can handle treasure, I'm going to give you a lot of treasure to handle. But if you failed that test, the master would look at him and go, no, I'm not going to give you any more treasure because I know you're just going to mishandle it. And so in the same way, God does that with our lives. He looks at us, and if we can handle the things that he has given us, then he is going to give us more. He is going to bless us. So God will reward us for our honesty. So as well, we're in the Ten Commandments. These are laws. And with laws, we can also look at this and we could say, hey, you know what? There's also, we can look at these and say, you know, we've broken some of these. We've done some of these things here. And one of the amazing things about Jesus is that Jesus promises forgiveness. That if we go to him and we say, God, we are really sorry for breaking these commandments, then God, who is faithful and just, will forgive us. And so, and also I wanted to close with one other quick thought here that's not even on your sheet, but it is copyright laws. Copyright laws are another way that people will steal. And so we have something called intellectual property, and there's a process for getting something copyrighted, a song, a book, a movie, or something like that. And if you go outside of those copyright laws and you violate them, then you are actually stealing their intellectual property. And the problem is sometimes you may not even know it. Like you may take an image from Google, use it for a project. Is that image copyrighted? And that's why I'm a huge proponent in purchasing stock footage, even though that it is expensive, but it's completely legal. And so I just give that to you as well, especially with things like YouTube, where you can just take a song or a movie clip and upload it without their permission. And unfortunately, YouTube is now starting to at least catch on to it and say, okay, this is copyrighted material. And so they may not allow you to monetize it or something like that, which is great, because I really respect that, because early on, people were taking, especially my favorite was like Christian music, like music about Jesus, and then they would steal that music and then they would upload it and they would monetize it. So they were actually the ones getting money for something that someone else made. It was absolutely insane. And so I just give that to you as well. But that is the seventh commandment. Do not steal. So there you go. Thanks for joining us.